Hello and welcome to the first session of the Net Zero Transition, sponsored by Capita. My name is Emma Gatten and I am the Environment Editor at the Daily Telegraph. This session is all about the game-changing technologies on the road to net zero. And so I will be, over the next 45 minutes, talking to our experts as they discuss what are the most important new technologies that we will see in the transition and whether they can really help turn the tide against climate change. I would now like to welcome my guests, Lord Adair Turner, the Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission, and Amali de Alwis, the CEO of SUBAC, which is the world's first accelerator for climate nonprofits. Thank you for joining us. So I just want to go first to Amali, and we'll hear some thoughts from you about your thoughts on the game-changing technologies in the transition to net zero.
Thank you so much. Really a pleasure to be joining. Technology is such a fascinating thing, isn't it? Because we can get very excited about all of these tools that we can build. And I think where we are now is that we actually have quite a lot of tools. We have a lot of sort of mechanisms which we can use to impact climate change, whether that's thinking about, our solar, our wind power, whether that's thinking about how we look at EVs, whether that's thinking about how we look at energy production. The question is now, how do we make sure that we use it in the right way? So I think, thinking about how those technologies are implemented, how that we make use of data, for example, to make sure that we're making the right decisions. And there are still some gaps. So, for example, I was reading an article yesterday which was talking about how, we still haven't quite figured out how we do EVs for large lorries, right? So we need to think about how we tackle our battery powers. When we think about, how do we do carbon sequestration, thinking about manufacturing sectors or thinking about building sectors, is that something that we need to develop further? So there are definitely areas that we need to address, but we do have a lot of technologies already which we can apply to tackling climate change. Part of the challenge is getting people to use them and think about how they can make use of them in a joined up way. So how do we make use of data to help us make better decisions about where we put EV charging spots, for example, across the UK network? How do we think about how do we interpret climate data to look at where there might be illegal logging going on in different areas? So how do we tie up a lot of these technologies to make sure that we're able to make those decisions? And also, I think, take people along the journey with us. And I think this is really going to be one of the critical things, which I think is going to be a big challenge for us. And, seeing all the announcements that we've seen over COP, we're setting a lot of targets, we're setting a lot of sort of challenges for us. Now is the point at which the technologies, the mechanisms, and the targets have to come together and sort of tie into the human behavior side and think about how do we make sure that we can take our populations along that journey with us and take into consideration the very real challenges that a lot of people will face and the fears around climate poverty and the expenses of these types of things. So these aren't easy challenges to address, but they are absolutely doable. So I think dialogue at this point around that is really critical as well.
That's great. I mean, I'm interested in what you were saying about this idea of taking people along with us, something that kind of comes up a lot, we hear a lot, but I wonder, what does that kind of mean in a very specific sense?
I think really going with people on their journey as they learn about some of these technologies. We've been hearing a lot about, let's say, heat pumps, for example. We've set targets around, our domestic use of gas and new boiler issues. I can imagine for a lot of people, it's probably quite a confusing thing to sort of think, well, what does this mean? Does that mean they're going to turn off my gas? Which obviously it doesn't. Does that mean that it's going to cost me, a huge amount of money? It might do in some cases, but there are also subsidies available. There are support available. So I think that education journey of helping people understand what this technology is about, as well as making sure that we have the right technologies there in the first place, is really critical.
Great, thank you. Really interesting. Adair, I'd really like to hear some of your thoughts.
Well, look, I think the good news is that we now know far more clearly than we did 10 years ago what are the key technologies that will get us to a net zero economy. And some of those have collapsed in price over the last 10 years. At the absolute core of getting to a zero carbon economy is two things. It's electrification and it's hydrogen. We will probably take our use of electricity from about 20% of all our final energy today is consumed in the form of electricity, and then Other bits are consumed in the form of gas or oil, petrol, gasoline, etc. That at 20% will go up to 60% or so, as we pretty much entirely electrify road transport, certainly passenger road transport and light and middle duty road transport. We will probably electrify a very large amount of a residential heat. And across much of the world, of course, there's far more air conditioning demand than residential heat demand. But broadly speaking, we will head towards a deeply electrified economy. We will also be able to decarbonize what we used to think were called the hard to abate sectors of the economy. But the Energy Transition Commission, which I chair, produced a report 3 years ago called Mission Possible. And it said, look, all of these supposedly hard sectors, steel or cement or chemicals, aviation, shipping, we can describe a way to get to net zero. And what is interesting is a lot of them involve hydrogen. For instance, it is highly likely that the use of coking coal, what's called metallurgical coal, to produce steel will collapse by about 90% in the next 30 years. And we will use hydrogen as what's called the reduction agent instead of coking coal. And so in addition to 60% or so of our energy coming in the form of electricity, there's probably 15 or even 20% will be used in the form of hydrogen in many different applications. And the good news is that the cost of both electrification and green hydrogen in particular has collapsed. Solar photovoltaics to produce electricity have come down in price by about 85% in 10 years. Wind has come down by 60%, and in particularly important for Britain, the cost of producing offshore wind has collapsed. And we have this extraordinary resource in the North Sea, which can power, frankly, almost all of our greatly increased electricity need. Batteries have also come down by 85% and will continue to fall further. I'm pretty confident that within 5-8 years, it will not only be cheaper to run an electric passenger car, it is already much cheaper to do that, but it will also be cheaper to buy them up front. So these technologies are transforming the costs, and one which is now beginning to move and has moved dramatically over the last 3 years. And there's a huge amount of talk about it here in Glasgow at COP26 with major investors across the world, is the cost of producing hydrogen from electrolysis. The cost of electrolyzers is going through a collapse, which we think will be about 80% within the next 5 years. So we do have a vision of how to get to net zero. There are some difficult issues, and we may want to talk about that. It's much more difficult to know how to end the harmful impact of the food and fiber system, the impact of that on deforestation, the methane emissions from cattle and sheep. There isn't a technological fix that we can go and grab hold of, but in many things to do with energy, building, industry, and transport, we are in a much better position now than we were 10 years ago because of these technology and cost trends over the last 10 years. And that puts us in a strong position now to really accelerate progress and to set the targets which the UK government has set for 2030, 35 and 50, all of which I think are achievable provided we deploy on a massive scale the technologies now available.
That's great, thank you. I mean, Adair, you, like me, are currently in Glasgow for the COP26 Climate Summit. So I'm interested to hear about what your impressions are of the role of technology and how important that has been so far and might be over the next couple of weeks.
Well, look, it's always very difficult at a huge conference like this, as I'm sure you're finding out, to work out what's really going on. There's huge numbers of people in different rooms. There are some negotiating arcane things to do with the treaty. There's others on stage making big political statements. There are pavilions for lots of different countries and technologies, etc. But I think there is a very strong technological theme here. The UK government has talked about what it calls the Glasgow breakthroughs, the commitments to make sure that during the 2020s, it becomes absolutely clear that it is cheaper to produce electricity everywhere in the world from renewable zero carbon sources than from coal or gas. We're pretty close to that. We're already there in many countries. Getting there in total is very important. Accelerating road transport electrification is another of these Glasgow breakthroughs, and hydrogen. strong focus on hydrogen, and also a strong combination of some big new commitments of money by big investors like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, tying with public sectors and banks, really focusing on specific technologies. So Bill Gates today talked about focusing on storage within the electricity system. This is the big challenge with renewable electricity systems. It's not how do you produce electricity. It's cheaper to produce electricity from renewables than it is from coal or gas. The challenge is, what do you do when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine? So the challenge, it's the only challenge, but it's a big challenge, is how do we store energy? And so there's a huge focus on all the different technologies, hydrogen, pumped storage, liquid air, compressed air, that can solve those problems. Big focus also, for instance, on sustainable aviation fuels. How do we make aviation fuels for long distance aviation, either out of biofuels or out of what's called synthetic fuels, actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere by direct air capture and creating hydrogen from electrolysis. So yes, there is, alongside the political process, alongside some very important statements today on deforestation, there is also a strong focus on technology, and there certainly needs to be that.
On the hydrogen question, something that I write about a lot is the question the government's facing about whether we'll use hydrogen in our home heating, whether it's going to replace gas in our boilers, in our hobs. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
That's the one. I think it's possible, but not certain. Whereas I think I can tell you for a certainty that very soon we will be producing steel, not using coking coal, but producing hydrogen. Indeed, I was shown yesterday by a man from SSAB, the Swedish company, and I'm sorry I don't have it with me, because he's going to give me one this evening, a piece of steel which has been produced with the hydrogen route. But across the world, lots and lots of steel companies going in that direction. Look, I think hydrogen will be used to produce steel. Hydrogen will be turned into ammonia, which then is used for fertilizer. So that use is there, but we've got to make it zero carbon hydrogen now, rather than dirty hydrogen made from methane, which is the thing at the moment. Ammonia is almost certainly, people may be surprised to know this, be what we burn in long distance container and tanker ships in 20 years' time. It looks like ammonia is the future route to zero carbon shipping. And you make ammonia with nitrogen and hydrogen. And I think those applications of hydrogen are pretty close to certain. Also, various uses of hydrogen in the chemical industry, as well as in the fertilizer side of chemicals on the plastic side. I think we just don't know the balance of it in the residential heating area, or whether it will go very predominantly down the electrification route. And that's one of the challenges. And by the way, I just wanted to pick up something said earlier. I think the biggest challenge we face in the UK is the residential heat side. A lot of the other decarbonizations will occur pretty much, automatically. Individuals won't notice them. Steel will get a tiny bit more expensive, but by the time that adds to the cost of your car, you won't even notice it, or the cost of your washing machine, you won't even notice it. So it won't be visible. On electric vehicles, people are going to save on their own household budgets quite significantly quite soon. They will be paying less for road transport services than they do at the moment. The challenge is residential heat. And that's where the investments in heat pumps could be significant. Once you've made those investments, you'll probably be paying less for the electricity to heat your house than you now do for the gas. But there's a significant investment en route to that. And I think that is the single biggest challenge in the UK's route to a zero carbon future.
Yeah, I mean, Amali, we're talking about huge changes that people are going to have to make in their homes, big new technology that's coming along. There's heat pumps, but there's also questions of, connecting your vehicle to your battery storage, your solar panels, etc. I mean, is there a risk that some people will not be able to sort of access this technology, either because of a lack of information or for other reasons?
I think that's the risk which we have to deal with now, right? I mean, that's the bit which is actually the sort of the where we need government support, I think, to step in and offer, subsidies to offer support as far as sort of, the financial costs of implementing some of these technologies. And even if we think about, for example, that, the heat use in the UK, we have some of the oldest housing stock in Europe, potentially in the world. A lot of our houses are sort of hundreds of years old, and that's fairly standard, and thinking about even things like insulation, obviously there's been a lot of conversation about. So these are definitely things that, we need to kind of actually start digging into these issues to try and understand what the real life applications and the real life implications will be when these technologies are introduced. I think, very much coming on with Lord Adair, a lot of these things, hopefully we can, in a way, as consumers, leave with companies to take care of on our behalf, and where we need to think about is the household parts which kind of connect to that. What I would say is that for anyone who's obviously worried about this, start educating yourself now. Because I think, when we think about planning for the future, these are the kinds of things which, no one wants to be surprised about. We need to plan for this like we make decisions for any other big things in our lives. And I think really making sure that you understand those things, especially as further legislations come in, no one wants to be caught unaware. So I think really understanding the implications is important.
I mean, a lot of this as well comes down to data and kind of personal data, because if we're thinking about the operation of a heat pump, for instance, they work best if they know when you need it to be on. If you think about the kind of smart charging systems, again, it's kind of like using data to work out when the times of great demand are. I mean, is there a concern, do you think, from a data privacy side to all of this?
I think a lot of that type of data that we're talking about is actually available through the organizations, the companies who actually deliver those services. So when we talk about, energy consumption data, when we talk about, EV sales or EV sort of charging points, when we think about, what times of day, consumption are highest as far as our heating costs and those types of things, all of that is available. I think the challenge will be to make sure that that data is made publicly available so that a lot of the companies who are driving innovations in this space can actually tie up, join the dots to a certain extent around that. So for example, I was having a conversation this morning with my head of data, and we were thinking about some of the data sets that we're looking to make available as part of our co-op, and thinking about, for example, looking at EV charging points, right? But how does that combine when you look at, let's say, logistics patterns? So what points of the year are actually logistic loads the heaviest? Or when do you look at retail data to look at, where people need to have products shipped to, and, does that fit in between where the EV charging points are, and does that fit with the capacity of the lorries which can take things there? So I think this is kind of the big challenge, which is, I think we've got a lot of these data sources available. We just need really careful sort of thinking around how does that translate into real life scenarios, and making sure that people are aware of where that data is, so that the organizations creating the technologies or the platforms or the infrastructure to support people are actually producing things in the right way and in the right places as according to human need. So yeah, it's a second level challenge, I think, from now on there.
I mean, from a day-to-day perspective, what is your sense of once we move to a net zero world, how different these things are going to feel? Is it transition from using a landline to using a mobile phone, or is it much more dramatic or less?
Yeah, and I think, even if we look at, how many of us probably had, I don't know, live fires in our house, going back sort of, 60 years or something like that. These are changes which we have had before. Change from that sort of lifestyle perspective is not new. And I do think in a lot of cases, we will just get used to those technologies. What we're going through are growing pains, right? We're going through a huge amount of change in a short amount of time, but we've done this before. We've removed, live fires from homes to reduce pollution. We've, stopped kids going up chimneys to reduce, deaths from sort of, industrial accidents. So I think, we have an incredible ability, I think, to adapt to those things. I think what will make the difference of how painful that adaptation is how much we actually support good communication around these, how much we actually listen to people around what some of those challenges are, so that we can build things in the right way. So I think, there is that exercise on top of the technology itself as well.
Great, thank you. Adair, you mentioned that we do still have some gaps in technology where we do need to come up with new inventions or to, get them to a better state. I mean, what would you say if you could identify the kind of key area where we are really going to struggle? But also, are there tech innovations that you are really excited about that are maybe at a very early stage?
Yes, look, I think the most difficult thing is everything to do with agriculture. As I say, I'm pretty confident that we can heat our homes in a new way. We can certainly have cars on an electric basis. We will make steel and cement in a zero carbon fashion. And to go back to the conversation we're having, I think in many ways, the changes to people's lifestyle or that will be, not nearly as big as some of the other changes that we've been through. But when I look at the impact of humanity on the natural system, and in particular the climate, the bit that I worry about is the roughly quarter which derives from our food and to a second extent our fiber system. It is that which is fundamentally driving deforestation, right? Let's be clear, the Amazon is being deforested to grow soya to be fed to beef cattle. That is what is going on. That's where that big impact is. Everything else, yes, mining has a bad impact sometime, but it's order of magnitude smaller than this agricultural impact. And various agricultural practices, just having cattle and sheep, produce methane emissions, and methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. And in these, we are not yet with clear technological fixes. Now, they may come along. I think it's pretty likely that synthetic meat, and I mean something which is really synthetic meat, which is something very close to the chemical equivalent of existing meat, may be a very, very big technology. There are people who say that, within 20 years, it will have replaced 75% of the global cattle herd, and it will be producing, meat which to you is indistinguishable from animal-based meat. I think it's possible that that would occur, but I think the crucial thing, you have to proceed on climate change by saying there are some possible technologies which could be game changers out there, but we shouldn't plan on those. We need a plan to avoid catastrophic climate change with the technologies that we know we've got at the moment. And then if these other technologies that come along, that's great. And that, to be blunt, is why I do think that it's in relation to the food system that it would be good to encourage some behaviour change. And I know that's controversial. And I know that the UK government recently binned the report from the Behavioural Insights Unit, because though I believe from the Behavioural Insights Unit that as a result, it's become their most looked at report of all time, which was not saying don't eat red meat. It was saying, move to eating red meat, high quality meat occasionally rather than all the time. And of course, an awful lot, people say, well, you'll never create the equivalent of a beef steak, etc. But an awful lot of meat is eaten in a semi-processed form, a burger form, etc. So look, I think this is one of our biggest challenges. I do think it's likely that we will see dramatic change there. And the reason why we'll see dramatic change is the core technology is the same technology which has produced this miracle of the vaccines in only a year after COVID broke. What is going on there is a far deeper analysis, an understanding that we had 10 years ago of the fundamental biological structures of life, and a far greater ability to look at it, to model its structure and to manipulate it. And that which has, people as we went into COVID says, it'll take you 10 years to develop a vaccine because that's what it used to take. And this extraordinary breakthrough of being able to make mRNA and other vaccines in only a year, that same technology, which is the understanding of biology and what's called synthetic biology, I think it's almost inevitable that that will produce quite a revolution in the way that we produce animal protein in future.
Interesting.
And just to jump in on that behavior side, we are already seeing some of these behavior changes. So especially, I guess, in sort of younger people, we are seeing more who are, looking at sort of low meat diets.
Yeah.
And, it's not the first time that we've done that. We younger generations are drinking less than previous generations did. We smoke less. So we know that we are capable of making some of these changes, but, it does take a little bit of time in some cases, and also a little bit of education and helping people to sort of see, look, this is the kind of things that you can get from that. So totally agree with that.
Amali, I'll put a similar question to you. Is there a kind of technology that you think is on the rise that you're quite excited about in this transition?
I mean, I think one of the big ones, and I know this has been mentioned already, but we are electrifying the world, and I think batteries is going to be the big one. This is the big one that we haven't really sort of thought about yet, and thinking about sort of grid structures, grid load, thinking about how we ensure that we're not having to flip onto sort of emergency generators or using sort of using coal sort of energy when we have times when we have low wind and these types of things. So I think that's going to be critical, and that's going to require not only the technology to come along, but for us to really completely rethink how we think about our energy infrastructure. Do we have centralized areas here? Do we have, batteries in people's homes? Do we have, common sort of, green gas sort of systems running through apartment blocks, whatever that is? So I think those are sort of the big ones that, to that march to electrification, what are the things that we can be looking at? And, as with any sort of infrastructure sort of challenge, those are often the things that take time as well. Buying an EV car is a relatively sort of quick thing. You can go and buy that. We now have some of that sort of infrastructure in place, but thinking about battery infrastructure, I think, is going to be a big challenge.
Question that has kind of come through from our listeners, which is actually, what do we do on that battery question about both recycling, but also this question of how we access the materials, the rare earths, etc., that we need for those. I don't know if either of you would like to pick up on that.
Well, let's clarify a set of use of terms. Batteries don't use rare earths. There are a set of elements. They're ones at a particular bit of the table, the periodic table. There are things like neodymium. They are used for electric motors and for magnets, etc. They are not the minerals which go into batteries. Batteries, the key minerals are lithium and manganese, nickel and cobalt. Which are not part of what we mean by rare earths. The other thing to realize is rare earths aren't very rare. There are a lot of rare earths in the world. Look, we have got to make sure that we think through the supply of these minerals, and some of them have an adverse local, environmental, or social impact. For instance, a very major problem with cobalt. Most cobalt, the majority of cobalt in the world comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there is clearly political risk, extractive industry, corruption risks. There is also a problem of children, what's called artisanal mines, which means little people with picks and shovels rather than automated mines. The good news is that we now know how to make a battery without any cobalt at all. Because what has happened is that the battery manufacturers have realized they've got a problem in the source of that, and they've said, we've got to fix this, and there's a technological fix there. Lithium, there's tons of lithium in the world. Well, lithium is one of the most common elements in the world, and there's also enough concentrated resources. There's a lot in Latin America. There's actually a fair amount in bits of Europe, including in Cornwall. We need to be very careful about how we mine it. If it's done badly, it has a bad local environmental impact. One of the things that you do, you are operating often in a salty environment, and you produce a byproduct of very salty water. But the thing I would ask you to think about is, in order to have all the lithium we need for all the batteries, because we only need a very small amount in each battery, we will probably have to mine at the peak about 7 million tons of pure lithium per annum. What do you think is going to be the local environmental impact of that compared with mining 7,000 million tons of coal per annum? 7 million versus 7,000 million. So yes, this new system we're building, it does have local environmental impacts. It does, 8 billion people can't live in the world without having some significant impact somewhere in the world on the local environmental impact. But whenever you look at it, the environmental impact of the system we are building is trivial compared with the environmental impact of fossil fuels. not only in terms of their climate effect, but also in the ways that they are actually mined and produced themselves.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Sorry, Amali, did you want to?
I was just going to say, yeah, I agree with all of those points. And I think this is where we really benefit from seeing these challenges as global challenges. And, when we're thinking about, for example, battery manufacturing, right? These materials are being shipped from one place to another where we can do things locally, what the cost of doing that. Thinking about the recycling part as well, how are we supporting our manufacturers to build in ways that these, materials can be extracted and that can be, either reused ideally or disposed of in appropriate ways. And even things like global legislation around. So, for example, we do have legislation around shipping batteries from one country to another, but we know that there are places where, where they should be shipped intact to reduce pollution, that's not happening, for example. So again, kind of how do we work with our global partners to make sure that we are creating safe systems and we're not just offshoring our problems onto other nations, I think is really important here as well.
I mean, we can do an awful lot of recycling of battery. I mean, the good news is that lithium and nickel and manganese is sufficiently expensive that there's a pretty big incentive to do recycling. And if you add, as Amali has said, tough regulation, and it should be very tough regulation, just forcing the battery manufacturers and the car manufacturers together to say, you are responsible for that battery at end of life. And you've got to pick it up and you've got to take it back. One thing we can do is reuse it. One thing you can do with a car battery is after, several years, a car battery only has 80% of the capacity that it started off with. That's typically 10 years or so. And then it's not good enough to use in a car battery. But you can take it out and use it in a grid battery space, as backup in the grid system. So a lot of car batteries will have a second use life to provide storage in the grid, but some of them can be recycled as well. So look, this won't happen automatically. It does have to be driven by very good practices by companies, forced on by strong regulation, but it is absolutely doable.
Because sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say, and as consumers, we can somewhat vote with our feet on some of these things as well. So, there's a lot of conversation these days about right to repair, for example, built-in obsolescence. So these types of things are where I guess we as consumers can be stepping in as well and asking that, our government petitions on our behalf for better legislation for items that can be reused, recycled, and can be kind of, dealt with without having to sort of encourage further consumerism or production where we don't need that in the future.
Interesting. And this kind of starts to touch on one of the questions that have been sent through before the session from Hina. I mean, Amali, what role do you see for the government in this transition compared to perhaps the private sector?
I think it has to be a combination of all of us. And for example, I think a really good example of this is looking at, for example, our gas legislation, right? We set these targets and said, okay, by this year, we want to make sure that people aren't continuing to build or implement gas boilers in houses, right? Now, that's the type of role which I think the government can play very effectively, which is to act as our foundation, to put that milestone and just say, okay, this is what we're aiming for, folks. And we're going to, we know we don't have all the answers, companies don't have all the answers, we don't have people who have all the answers, but this is what we need to make sure that we are keeping within that 1.5 degree margin and making sure that we have some sort of chance of achieving that. So I think government have a really critical role to play within that, but they aren't the answer to it. All they can do is set the drumbeat behind that and help us with, I guess, the legislation. We need to do the executing as companies, as technology firms, as consumers, to actually make sure that we're developing the products and services which can kind of meet those requirements.
Interesting. And Adair, we've had a question from Jill who asks, why are we focusing on new technology? Is there some old technology that's also going to help us here?
Well, I just want to make a comment and link that to a question somebody called CH has said. I thought that hydrogen could be the answer, but a recent article said that in the production using electricity, production produces both carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. That is completely wrong. Just can I clarify? There are two ways to produce a hydrogen. One is you start with methane, you start with gas, and you split it in a process called steam methane reforming. and that does produce CO2, and that will only be zero carbon hydrogen if you then capture that CO2 and store it in a process called carbon capture and storage. And some people call that blue hydrogen. But if you make hydrogen from electricity, it's an old technology. If I only had a battery and 2 wires here, I could demonstrate it. You take a glass of water, you take a battery, attach a wire to the positive and the negative, put them in the water, try it this evening at your house if you'd like, and you will see bubbles coming off the wires. And off those wires, there'll be oxygen coming off one wire, and there'll be hydrogen coming off the other wire. And that is all they are producing. This is all they can produce, because in water, H2O, there's only hydrogen and oxygen. I mean, I certainly did that as a kid. I think many of you could do it as a kid. I think many of your children have probably done it at chemistry and physics lessons at school. It's a very easy thing to do. And the production of hydrogen from electrolysis is actually an old technology. Up until 1945, most of the nitrogen fertilizer in the world was produced in Norway. Why was it produced in Norway? It was produced in Norway because Norway was the cheapest place to produce ammonia, because it was the cheapest place to produce hydrogen, and it was the cheapest way to produce hydrogen because it had lots of hydropower. And that made it the cheapest way to produce nitrogen fertilizers, which are made out of nitrogen and hydrogen synthesized together into ammonia. And what happened was that methane gas got so cheap that it replaced electrolysis as the way of producing our hydrogen. But all we need to do is go back to a technology which was actually the dominant way across the world of producing hydrogen back, in the middle of the 20th century. So you are absolutely right, Jill. Sometimes we are discovering things from the past. And another interesting wrinkle, back in 1890, there was as many electric cars on the road as internal combustion engine cars. The internal combustion engine and the electric engines we've always recognized are far better engines. An internal combustion engine will always take 75% of the energy you put into it and will turn it into completely wasted heat, which is of no value. Only about 25% will drive the car forward. An electric engine is a much better engine. It'll turn about 95% of the energy you put into kinetic energy to drive the car forward, and only 5% in wasted heat. But our challenge was not the internal combustion engine didn't win because the engines were better. It won because petrol or diesel is a much more concentrated way to store energy than batteries. And what we need to now do is get those batteries so good. There'll never be as good a way of storing energy as petrol or diesel, but they are now getting good enough that we can at last revert to the electric engines, which back in 1890, we always knew were better engines than internal combustion engines.
Fascinating. I'm just going to say, I don't think we can take responsibility for if that experiment goes wrong, if you do try it.
A blue Peter job there, yes.
Well, what I used to do is put a test tube over the hydrogen thing, and then you take it out and you strike a match. You've got a very satisfying pop.
Please be careful. Amali, a lot of these technologies that we're talking about, they're part of the UK government's current plans for its net zero transition. I mean, to what extent do you think that the UK can be a leader in this? I mean, we are trying to be at the forefront, but we're still competing with China, we're competing with the EU, etc. So how do we come out ahead in this?
To be honest, I think we already are a leader in a number of areas, and in a way, it's a race which we're all losing at the same time. It's kind of, we're doing a really good job in certain areas, but actually not still a good enough job to look at the bigger problem. So I think in a way it's not that it doesn't matter whether or not we're leading. It's more about how do we drive things forward and help others to go on that journey as well from a global perspective. Because even if we fix our energy problem and we manage to get all of our energy from, renewable energies and get all of our cars, using sort of electricity and all of our homes heated by that, if that's not being tackled in India, in China, in Africa, we really haven't got a hope with that. So I think this is where we need to be working together. We have to be sharing our knowledge, our expertise, and helping others as well, and recognizing that. I think, and it's been fantastic to see actually a number of the pledges. I think Japan came on today, which has just nudged our 100 billion pledge, I think, to help sort of developing countries with decarbonisation there. And getting onto, over that threshold. So we have to be sort of thinking about this as a global issue and what we can be doing as a sort of a global player to enable that as well. Do I think that, we have a good chance to help with that? Absolutely. We still have, some of the best educational institutions. We have, leaders in health sciences, in biosciences. We are setting ourselves goals, which a number of other countries are now sort of setting themselves and sort of saying, we should set similar types of goals. So, there is a lot to be done, but I think we should be, very proud of what we have done already so far. But with that message that, we are just starting to scratch the surface, I think, between us.
Thanks. I wanted to ask, Phil had a question, Adair, about carbon capture and storage. I think he's particularly saying, is it feasible that we can capture carbon and sequester it under the ground for long periods of time? But maybe you can give us more broadly your thoughts on whether carbon capture and to some extent greenhouse gas removals are going to be a big part of the net zero picture.
When I was the first chair of the UK's Climate Change Committee, when it was first set up in 2008 to 12, and if you'd asked me how do we decarbonise an electricity system, I would have said we should back 3 different technologies: fossil fuel with carbon capture and storage, nuclear and renewables. But since then, the estimates of nuclear went up from those we were looking at in 2008. The estimates of carbon capture and storage have not come down. And the actual facts of the cost of wind and solar and batteries to store it with, and now electrolyzers, have come down by 70, 80, 90%. And when the facts change, I change my mind. And so I see very little role now for carbon capture and storage in the power system. It may be used at the margin to add to gas, which is used to back up the variable renewable system. But I think it's far more likely that eventually we will make hydrogen via electrolysis in the times when we have more wind and solar than we need. And then we will burn that hydrogen in gas turbines to produce electricity when we don't have enough. So I think that's likely to be the major dominant form of balance. So most people around the world now are assuming a very, very small role for carbon capture and storage in the power system. And that's a real complete change from 15 years ago. Where I think we will see it is that there are some industrial sectors, and I think particularly cement, where it's difficult to see how we get to zero carbon without carbon capture and storage, because the way that you make cement is you start with calcium carbonate. For those of you who can remember your basic chemistry, that is CaCO3. And you first of all calcine it and you produce calcium oxide, which is CaO. And if you just write that down on a piece of paper, you will see that you will inevitably produce some carbon dioxide. The very chemical process. It's not the energy input. We can change the energy input to cement. We can turn that to hydrogen or indeed to electricity. It's the chemical process of producing cement emits carbon dioxide. So we have these relatively small number of specific industrial applications where I think we will need carbon capture and storage. But we see this as basically from maybe 40 gigatons of CO2 being emitted in the global economy today. We think we get it down to 5 gigatons, and then you do a couple of gigatons of carbon capture and storage. Not that the vast majority is done by actually getting rid of the emissions entirely rather than carbon capture and storage. There's a separate thing as to whether to make the climate balance, we need what are called negative emissions, whether we actually need to suck some CO2 out of the atmosphere in a process called direct air capture and then store it, or indeed do reforestation projects, which are nature's way of capturing CO2 and storing it. I think we must not rely on that to any significant extent. And there's a danger that if people get too excited by that, they think, oh yeah, sometime in the future, I'll do these negative emissions, so I don't need to do anything else. We must not do that. I think we must commit that 95% of the reduction is going to come by real reduction. But there will be a leftover bit where we probably do need, for the last few percent, these negative emissions. And I think we will see a combination of reforestation projects which increase the soil absorption, CO2 absorption of soil. And I think we probably will see direct air capture. At the moment, it would be very expensive. It would be costing you $300 a ton of CO2 to suck this stuff out of the atmosphere and to store it. But there are guys around, I'm meeting one of them tomorrow here in Glasgow, who are being backed by, big investors who say that they can get that down to $100 a ton. Now, if they can get it down to $100 a ton, then it will be part of the solution, but I stress it has to be a small part of the pollution solution, not a big part.
Yeah, it's an absolutely kind of very interesting growing area, I think, direct air capture. There seems to be a kind of change in the mood around it as well. We have unfortunately run out of time. I think we could have gone on for twice as long. So I'd just like to say thank you so much to Lord Adair and to Amali for the really interesting discussion and insights you've given to me and to everyone watching. And thank you to the audience for tuning in this evening and for your great questions.